My name is Ed Mead, and I'm here with the second podcast in the Viewber series, and I'm very pleased to welcome Vanessa Warwick, who doesn't really need any introduction to anybody who knows anything about property, and she certainly needs no introduction to either a microphone or indeed her husband, who's here filming us as we speak. It's good to have you here, Vanessa. We've spoken before quite often, and the areas in which you specialise are, or you've come to specialise, are very much borne out by your own experience in life. In other words, you've built up a significant portfolio of property. So tell me a little bit about your property portfolio and indeed the service that I think it's going to be 10 years old next year, Property Tribes.
It is.
So tell us a little bit about Property Tribes and your experience as a landlord.
Well, myself and Nick got involved in property in 2004. We were working in the broadcast TV arena, where I was directing big music specials and so forth. One of my claims to fame is that I directed Motorhead's 25th anniversary concert at Brixton Academy. So,
I've got a story about Motorhead, listeners, but I'm not going to tell that here and now. All right?
So I like to say that I went from rock and roll to bricks and mortar. And when I met Nick, I guess we were getting tired of being in the media industry. Obviously YouTube was coming along, it was having a big impact on the kind of programming that was being commissioned, the budgets, and Nick said, we're working really long hours and I can see that this isn't going to carry on forever. We really need to do something to secure our financial future and have a life where we can do all the things that we love to do, because Nick and I love to travel and see the world, and that's what got us into property. And we went on a 2-day educational weekend for 2 days, and we just never looked back. We totally immersed ourselves in the sector, and over the years we've built up quite a significant property portfolio. We started with flats in London, diversified into family homes in the southeast in the M3, M4 corridor. We've got a little bit of stock up north, and we've got a couple of holiday lets on the south coast. And it was really through being immersed in the property sector, and I couldn't find anywhere where I could go and have a really robust and professional debate, because I believe that being a landlord, you have to adopt a business attitude. You have to treat it as a profession. And I mentioned this to Nick one day in February 2009, and he said, well, look, I'll put a platform up for you and you can just chat there. And he went on this free platform, set it up, called it Property Tribes. I invited my friends along, and to cut a very long story short, it just grew and grew and grew and grew. And we realised about 6 years ago that we had something really quite special. We moved it to a bespoke platform that we had coded ourselves, and we turned it into a commercial entity to fund it, because obviously there's massive server space involved and those kind of things, and developers. And the version that you see today is propertytribes.com. That's the third incarnation of our landlord community. And it just keeps on going.
So it really brings together the two things which which is the media world and property.
It does indeed. And it was Nick that really said, I think 6 or 7 years ago, we should start a YouTube channel, because we've got all these skills. Nick was a cameraman, I was a producer, director and presenter, and we started our YouTube channel, and just recently we've topped 500,000 views, and we've got over 750 videos on there.
So it really sort of plays into the modern zeitgeist, doesn't it, really? Because if we look at what's been happening and what's coming down the tracks with buy to let, I mean, you and I have had several conversations both on social media and in real life about the changes that are happening at the moment. I think most people who are listening to this, the reason they'll be listening to it probably is because they know exactly what's coming down the tracks and they want to know what we want to say about it. And effectively what the government have been doing over the last 2 or 3 years is to, I think ultimately it's to professionalise the landlord game, if I can put it like that.
Yes.
Would that be a fair description of what they're doing?
I think it would. And I think the big problem is that the vast majority of landlords in the UK don't even know they're on the track and that there's a train coming. Because if we take the home let figures, which is what we tend to refer to, it's believed there's around 2.5 million landlords in the UK.
Home let?
Home let.
HomeLet is what? For our
Yes,
listeners?
it's a information resource and other bits and pieces. But there's 97% of those 2.5 million landlords are what are called small landlords who have 3 or less properties. So they are the mass landlord market. And they don't even know they're a landlord because they're a teacher, a vet, a solicitor, they have a career, and they're very busy in their workaday world, and they've got a few properties on the side, so they don't think like a landlord, they don't engage like a landlord. And as I said, they are the mass market. The 3% with 4 or more properties are the professional portfolio landlords. And unfortunately, there is this massive communication issue with the small landlord, because they're not in a landlord mindset. They don't know about...
But I presume, Vanessa, that's slightly exacerbated by the fact that because of the changes that are coming down the line, which are now beginning to bite, finally, these issues of not being able to set off your mortgage interest to quite the extent you used to be able to, not allowed wear and tear allowances, etc., etc. A lot of the way that landlords these days can make more money is by abandoning their estate agent as well, their lettings agent.
Yeah.
So that's another reason why they're finding it difficult to know where to go to communicate, because quite often, as you said, I didn't quite understand the expression when you first used it, landlords who don't know their landlords. I now understand it. I can see what you mean, and they don't have anywhere to go, so they probably, or they may increasingly often not have an agent. So where do they go? I suppose they go to propertytribes.com. That's the objective of why you set it up.
Well, of course, we couldn't foresee this coming when we set it up, and actually I believe that all landlords starting out should use a reputable lettings agents that regulated via either ALA, NALS or RICS, because there are over 160 government statutes and regulations that landlords have to adhere to in order to be compliant, and clearly the government has introduced some very serious penalties and fines if you're found to not be compliant, up to £30,000 per offence. So it's actually a serious business risk not to be compliant, let alone that you may be putting your tenant in danger in some way. Landlords, they have to supply safe and compliant homes for their tenants, and a lot of the sort of rhetoric, anti-landlord sentiment around at the moment is because, a small minority of landlords aren't doing that. So we are in a funny position, because I believe that landlords, that the letting agent is hugely valuable to a landlord. All our properties are fully managed through agents. We don't manage any of our own at the moment, although I have done in the past. And with the advent of Section 24, which is this new very harsh tax regime that will affect a significant number of landlords, one of the things that landlords are going to have to do to mitigate that is to look at reducing their costs. And an obvious thing is to separate from their lettings agent and self-manage. So we're in a very strange situation, because the vast majority of landlords out there, I don't even believe that they're aware of Section 24. They just don't know what's coming down the track towards them, and it really is going to become as a big shock to them.
Yes, so in other words, if they're looking for, because an awful lot of buy-to-let landlords, my experience, and I've been in estate agency and letting since 1979, and back then there were quite a lot of people that used to buy homes to rent them out, but they never used to look at one word that never seemed to be included in their investment speech was the word yield. They all bought them and just thought, well, I'll let it out just to sort of keep it lived in and keep it warm, and so I can afford the odd bit of painting, and the long-term game was all about capital value.
Yep.
Now everything seems to be predicated on yield, and of course if people are going to increase their yield, at the moment they're paying, they could be paying anything between 5 and 15% to have their property managed, depending on how heavily it's managed. And if they're looking to get some more yield, in inverted commas, they have to increase that by getting rid of some of the costs.
Yep.
To what extent where does the balance sit between yield and capital value, do you think?
I think that's one of the holy grail questions of property investment. I mean, everybody, frequently coming onto Property Tribes saying, oh, I want yield and I want capital growth. In my experience, they just don't come together. It's really one or the other. I personally have a lot of concerns about novice landlords being attracted up north to where the property prices are very, very cheap. You know, we're talking 40, 50, £100,000, and not understanding that those kind of areas can come fraught with difficulties. I always say, if a boiler goes on a £40,000 property, it's still £2,000 to replace it on a property that's bringing in maybe £300-400 a month, as it is on a £500,000 property. It's the same cost, it's £2,000, but that £2,000 on a cheap property will actually wipe out your any kind of profit for a significant portion of the year. So for my part, I believe it's always cash flow first, because if you are making net profit month on month, it allows you to stay in the game longer to benefit from any potential capital growth. Cash flow month on month is money in your pocket that you can spend. Capital growth is entirely speculative. None of us can say where there's going to be capital growth. If there's going to be capital growth, there may even be a decline in property prices because of Brexit and economic concerns. A lot of talk about that at the moment. So I've always advocated focusing on month net income from the rent.
Well, I think that obviously makes a lot of sense, and that's very good advice. And although landlords or people who are considering investing in property, they may not know what capital values are going to do, what they can do is do a calculation on how their income will be, assuming they know what they're going to be borrowing. They're going to know what their potential changes are in the bottom line over the next sort of 3 or 4 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, looking at your own portfolio, I'm assuming that Section 24, which for those who don't know it's a section of the 2015 Finance Act, which was brought in to, as we said earlier, to sort of professionalise the industry. But the objective, a lot of people have looked at it very negatively and thought, they're trying to drive buy-to-let landlords out of the market. But the bottom line is that their bottom line will change. So if you look at your own portfolio, for instance, what effect will it have over the next sort of 3 or 4 years on the bottom line? I mean, I know it's incremental, but it will have an effect on us.
It certainly will. We will be affected by Section 24, and we have looked at all the possible ways of mitigating that impact. And so far, I've yet to find a satisfactory way of doing that. So our personal strategy is that we've sold a couple of the more poorly performing properties, and I'm just battening down the hatches and looking to survive the storm, because I absolutely 100% believe that Section 24 cannot last. It's deterring landlords from investing in the sector. There's a massive disconnect between local government and central government. Central government doing all sorts of things to deter landlords from buying investment properties, deter them from expanding their portfolios, deterring newbies coming into it. Whereas at local government, you've got housing teams screaming for landlords. They're now offering golden hellos of £2,000 for landlords to come onto their books. We know of one local authority alone that has 3,500 families on their waiting list that they can't put into social housing.
Hasn't that been slightly, though, to an extent? There's been quite a backlash, hasn't there, about tenants not letting to local authority tenants. Why is that? I mean, is it because of the change? I know there was a change in the law, wasn't there, a few years ago, where benefits were paid to the claimant, who then paid them who then is meant to pay them to the landlord, whereas in the old days it got paid straight to the landlord. Now, obviously, if you are a landlord and you're being paid by your local authority, that's gold-plated. You can sort of understand why people, if they're being given the money, may not necessarily why council tenants might not want to pay that money over. Has that been why there's been this issue?
Well, that's to do with universal credit, which is being rolled out across the country at the moment. And I think statistically 3 out of 4 tenants in receipt of universal credit are in rent arrears. And there are many landlords that are absolutely dreading universal credit arriving in their area. And no doubt a lot of them will be serving notice on tenants in receipts of benefits, because they don't want to be sucked into this universal credit system, which is so complex. Previously, you were dealing, as a landlord, you were dealing with the local authority housing team. Now you have to deal with the DWP, and it's like a faceless brick wall. Even tenants struggle to get through it. So that's one reason. The other reason is that a lot of lenders do not allow in your mortgage terms and conditions to let to tenants and receipts of benefits. So there's lots of reasons actually, and also that demographic of tenant does unfortunately sometimes come with a bad reputation. That they don't look after the properties, that they don't pay the rent, and so on.
Well, I suppose if the local governments or local authorities wanted to perhaps do a bit more on the I hesitate always to call it affordable housing, affordable rented housing. They should be looking at the caps, trying to persuade government to raise the caps against borrowing for them, so they can go and build their own housing. We all know that one of the biggest problems for that sector is that there isn't enough housing available. Yet the money seems absolutely ridiculous to me that at a time of record low interest rates, central government doesn't allow local authorities to borrow more money to build housing. It's such an obvious thing.
Well, it is, and what's even more astonishing is that the local authorities, their bill for temporary accommodation and B&B accommodation is going absolutely through the roof. It's costing the taxpayer far, far more to house people in B&Bs and temporary accommodation than it is for a private landlord to provide the service for them. I'm aware of a hotel in Oxford. The top 2 floors have been completely taken over by people that the council cannot house, and there are families living in one hotel room with no catering facilities. That is how serious this issue is, and nobody's talking about it. So you've got councils with increasingly growing waiting lists. They want to discharge their housing obligations into the private sector, but they can't because central government is deterring landlords and pushing us away.
Yeah, it's a very politically charged area, isn't it? It's like talking about. I mean, the NHS has the same problem. They pay a fortune for sort of locums and temporary staff, and it's another issue of bad management and not addressing the bigger issues over the years, and it's exactly the same thing with housing.
It is. Can I just say that a version of Section 24 was introduced in Ireland, and it lasted about 3 years. They had to completely cancel it, and they are now offering landlords incentives to come back into the sector because it absolutely decimated the stock of private landlord housing.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose the other thing that's been changing, and which is again coming down the tracks to some extent with landlords, is the issue of affordability, isn't it? And coverage for your mortgage payments. And that's changed recently as well, hasn't it? It
has. I think there's 3 main areas that are creating threats for landlords, if you choose to look at them like that. The first one is regulation and legislation. The second one is taxation, which we've already just been talking about. And the third one is indeed finance. Typically in the past, landlords were able to finance or leverage up to around 75% loan to value by using mortgage finance, but the government introduced the PRA, the Prudential Regulation Authority guidelines about 2 years ago now, and it severely restricts how much landlords can borrow. So bottom line is landlords are having to put in much bigger deposits, which means they can buy less property.
What, typically 50% sort of thing? Or?
I would say the average is now probably it's probably 55 to 65% loan to value. So a typical deposit is now around 35%. But again, it does depend where you are in the country, and it does depend on the kind of rental yields in that particular area. So actually in the southeast, the PRA is having much more impact where yields are lower than up in the north. And again, that's what's pushing landlords up north without actually fully understanding what some of the issues are up there.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. So we've covered really. I mean, the regulation is terrifying. I mean, as you say, 160 points for a landlord. That is a real minefield.
It is.
And are they criminal convictions you get if you get it wrong?
There are.
But criminal
It
penalties.
really depends the nature and the severity.
Yeah, sure, but the fact is there's an awful lot of red tape you've got to be careful of.
There is.
Then in terms of the taxation, we've talked about that, and then obviously you've just talked about the finance. So there are very, very few bright spots for the time being. But before we turned on and started recording here, we were talking about about all these issues, about all the headwinds, and of course, headwinds like this do produce opportunity to some extent.
Yeah.
How would you characterise that opportunity at the moment? I mean, how would you see it?
I think the opportunity is going to be for the landlord who is educated, informed, explores all the angles. Clearly there are ways to mitigate Section 24. One of them is to incorporate, so we're seeing a huge increase in incorporated landlords, and indeed I suspect those incorporated landlords may well be hoovering up the properties that are being sold by the small non-professional landlord. I always think there will be opportunity. Personally, I'm a big advocate of holiday lets. I know that's not offering full-time accommodation. Still, it's a property investment, and holiday lettings are not affected by Section 24.
Okay, so it's a sort of Warren Buffett approach. When everyone else is selling, you should be buying a little bit.
I'm sure there's going to be some bargains to be had, because there's going to be a lot of landlords that bought very heavily in the go-go years between maybe 2000 and 2008, where they built very large, highly leveraged portfolios very quickly. They're going to probably be in, I would say, negative equity, if not negative cash flow as well, and all of this other stuff coming down on them, along with potential interest rate rises. Those landlords, they're really going to struggle, and I'd be surprised if they survive. So fortunately in our case, we bought good quality properties in good areas that have enjoyed some very significant capital growth over the 14 years, so our loan to value has decreased quite significantly since when we started. So it's going to be the era of the smart landlord going forward, the professional landlord, the landlord that treats it as a business, the landlord that understands their tenant demographic, how to market their property, how to keep the occupancy up. I think we'll see a lot of landlords perhaps moving more into kind of build to rent type scenarios. And a lot of landlords perhaps moving to semi-commercial and mixed use, because property, as you know, Ed, comes in so many different shapes and sizes and formats and flavours, and there's always something that you can pick out.
Yeah, and it's definitely a fascinating area. I mean, one of the killers, obviously, of yield, we can still talk about yield, is obviously voids, and you just mentioned that. And people often don't put enough emphasis on that, particularly the landlords who don't know their landlords. You know, they really won't understand how devastating a couple of months' worth of void can be. Are you a fan of what's been mooted recently about some of these longer tenancies, which now seem to have been booted into the long grass?
I don't see a point for them. The thing that tenants love about being able to rent a property is the flexibility. Landlords do not, whatever the media might say, they do not issue Section 21 notices willy-nilly. All landlords who are taking a long-term view, they want tenants to stay as long as possible. I think statistically that 97% of Section 21s have come about because the landlord was selling up, or they wanted. These
are notices to quit, Section 21 notices.
Or rent arrears, and a landlord should be allowed to get possession of their property.
Well, I completely agree with that. I think we need to be aiming at a much more build to rent style. So, I mean, if you do go to some country, my son lives in Berlin, and Berlin's a nightmare in itself because there aren't enough places to live, so it's going up in value quite quickly. But the Germans seem to have quite a good model for their pension funds to invest in huge developments. But it seems to me that is partly due to the fact that they simply don't have any capital growth in Germany, so it is all about yield. So therefore the pension funds require a yield to pay the pensions. So they buy and build these bulletproof developments, and people can have very long tenures because they're built to rent, so people can live in them for as long as they like. And I also get very, I'll say it on air, pissed off with quite a lot of people who characterise landlords exactly in a way that you just alluded to there, where they think they're always going to get be booted out or whatever. The vast majority of landlords, and this is my experience over a very long period of being in the game, is that they have very long-term views for their properties. They're not just trying to rip people off or make the maximum money. They want an easy life. They want the asset to look after itself. They want to make a little bit of money from it if they can in terms of extra living expenses, but the chances are they'll keep it for a very long time. Someone will probably move into it, one of their children or whatever, at some point in the future. They have all sorts of reasons.
Yeah.
And of course all of this is against a backdrop of the fact that if you haven't got money in property, what the hell do you put it in at the moment?
Quite.
I mean, there really isn't anything else.
Well, Ed, you've just described the exact demographic of what we call the small or amateur landlord, which, as we said earlier, makes up 97% of the marketplace. They want to provide a good level of service for their tenants. Maybe they're not au fait with all the legislation, and that is not acceptable. Ignorance can never be an excuse, and this is why, one of the reasons Nick and I started Property Tribes was to make better landlords so that tenants would have a better experience of the sector. But I think the other thing is that I would like to see is that tenants become more proactive in actually vetting the landlord. And I would welcome that as a landlord. I always say to any prospective tenant, I'm in this for the long game. You're welcome to have that property as long as you need it for. I have no intentions of selling it, as far as I'm aware. And most of our tenants have been with us between 4 and 7 years, which is a long time.
But that's a really interesting twist, the idea that a tenant might vet, in inverted commas, the landlord. I mean, how would they go about that? Just by asking some questions.
Ask some questions. Are you a member of a landlord association? I'm proud to say that I'm a member of the Residential Landlords Association and also iHouse Association. And I would, put the landlord's name into Google, see what comes up. I get very angry when I see, particularly on Facebook, because we certainly wouldn't allow it on Property Tribes, is where I see landlords talking about tenants, calling them scum. I will not entertain that. And, if you go onto Facebook and look around and see a landlord that you're thinking of working with complaining about the fact that the tenant complained the heating isn't working, then you would know to steer clear of that individual.
Yeah, well, that's a very fair point. What do you think about the registration of landlords? Do you have any? I mean, we don't have a lot of time left, but what's your opinion of that? Necessary, unnecessary?
My general feeling about all of this is that local authorities have very far-reaching powers to enforce the existing legislation. They're not doing it.
Because they don't have the manpower, right?
I don't know why they're not doing it. Perhaps they don't have the manpower. That could be one of the reasons. But, there is no reason that rogues should be able to exist with all the, if all the enforcement was used against them. But there's so little of it. So rather than, what we've taking what's already in existence and enforcing and using the enforcing powers that are there, why add more and more red tape? It's not going to solve the problem.
No, well, I rather agree, and bearing in mind that we've got a private rented sector which is bigger than the assisted sector now, it's really something which needs to be looked after. Look, Vanessa, we could sit here all day. Unfortunately, we're very much running out of time. I mean, I'm personally a big fan of what you do, and I think I see you dishing out advice. You're a columnist in various places, and you do all sorts of things, which is great. And to be honest with you, I think the word landlord communication is the important thing here.
Yeah.
And I mean, if people want to understand, I think I'm right in saying that propertytribes.com there are lots of different forums there where people can go and not just air their grievances, but actually genuinely find out how can I put it? The best way for a landlord to help someone else is, or the best people to help a landlord are landlords themselves.
Yes.
And that's exactly what it does.
That's exactly what it does. And, I can't take credit for it because we've got thousands of users on there every day, and I wouldn't want to take credit for it. My role there is really community manager, and also I do start a lot of the discussions. I write articles and so on, and I do answer a lot of questions. But ultimately, it is a community-generated data bank. And what I like to say is that by using a site like Property Tribes, you can make other people's hindsight your foresight. So all the mistakes that I made as a landlord when I started out, and indeed I still do make the odd mistake, by talking about it on Property Tribes, I can stop people falling into those pitfalls, and people can come along and ask their questions and get their problems solved.
Let people learn from other people's mistakes. Well, look, Vanessa, thank you very much. I mean, just for our listeners, I mean, Property Tribes is, there are 4,000 individual visitors a day, 25,000 page views a day, 40,000 registered users, but a lot more guests than that use it. So this is a very big forum.
It's not only that, Ed, it's just very, very active and engaged, and there are a lot of very experienced landlords and indeed property professionals on there, like David Smith is a commentator on there. He's policy director of the RLA and a solicitor for Anthony Gold Solicitors in London, expert on tenant and landlord law. He's on there answering questions. We've got the tenancy deposit scheme on there answering questions. So it's a very engaged, busy place where you get some really sound advice.
Yeah, well, I think that's great, and I gather you're off to the heart of government tomorrow to talk, so clearly a lot of people think you're worth talking to.
Thank you.
I certainly do, so thanks very much for coming in. Appreciate it.
Well, Ed, thank you very much for your support of Property Tribes as well through Viewber. It's been really great to have you on board as well, so thank you for everything that you do for the private rented sector as well.
Thank you very much.